principally, of course, French books. These had guided the reading habits of the aristocracy. Herder searched for ancient roots of the German culture, for an oral tradition that could establish a sense of origin. He looked also, and most poignantly, for a common culture that could bind together the inhabitants of the various German states that pockmarked Europe's map at that time. The task at hand was not just the discovery of an oral culture, but the creation of an overarching German nation. To be a poet or a thinker, a person of Bildung, was therefore for him no individual's trace. It had to be the characteristic of a new nation. Nationhood was to transcend the notion of class. And while Herder called for and Museus searched for the fairy tales of the simple folk, these tales would tell about the middle classes' culture as well, also that of the aristocracy and farmers, as long as they were German. With this notion of Bildung, Humboldt may have envisioned a new Prussian bourgeoisie. With his notion of the formed, gebildete Volk, Herder envisioned a German nation. His idea of Bildung was projected into the future too. It was to become a national endeavor. Folk songs and fairy tales were early examples and stepping stones en route to the formation of a German culture for a not yet realized Germany. Museus did not call himself an author, therefore. He was simply a collector, recording and reproducing a people's voice. His simple folk was not at all educated, and here you see not only how Bildung and education separate, but in this case, it's almost the contrary. Well, it is the contrary. But already in the throe of Bildung, they could tell tales that would document the origins of a people's imagination. An old soldier, for example, becomes the carrier of a tradition in Museus's book, and he would implicitly distinguish between an artificial Bildung, which is mere education brought from the outside and therefore symbolized by the French, and the innate, natural, true Bildung that was German. That latter Bildung arose from an ancient simplicity that pointed right to the heart. Thus, Herder and Museus established a Bildungsprogramm as well, namely that for the German folk. What was important here was the absence of foreign traces. Museus was eager to state that his tales were no foreign inventions. That's a quote. I quote further. The shape of the fairy tale, he writes, is colorful according to the time, customs, thought, and in particular theogony and spiritual state of each people. It's always that theology comes always in again. All of this impresses its fantasy. But I think that the national character offers itself there as well, just as in the mechanical works of art of each people. Museus' collection of fairy tales becomes thus a textbook of new German nationhood that Herder also thought to define and that was vigorously discussed at this age. Literature in particular was to document the characteristics of a nation and thus become the mirror of a people who was on route of recognizing its properties and identities. Far from being simply entertaining, his tales and the literature in general had a political task. They did not simply address single readers, but aided the Bildung or formation of a whole nation. The literature selected for this task was, however, no literature yet, nothing fixed, printed, or published. These were oral narratives that were prized for their oral qualities, including the task of memorization. The authors had to be unknown, fatherless. They did not only characterize the German nation, but were ready to be adopted by it. Born from the people's tongues, the fairy tales were truly owned by all Germans. And here we find a curious argument. What made these tales German was not the language alone in which they were conveyed, but the fact of their oral transmission. Never mind the success of Goethe's recent novels. But paradoxically, of course, museums would have to write them down and print these fairy tales to make his argument about oral culture. But even Herder argued for fluid transition. William Shakespeare's works, for example, still held many oral traces. His dramas were definitely not French, at least not following any French tradition, and therefore I call Nordic, and therefore I call almost German. Wilhelm and Jakob Grimm followed Museus with their own collection of fairy tales. Here, a new paradox arose. In noting down orally traded tales, the same kind of development, the brothers Grimm often recorded the German retellings of published French fairy tales of the 18th century, such as those by Charles Perrault. It was not easy to establish the cultural heritage of the German nation. But it was also clear that it would have to establish itself by opposition. Oral versus print culture, a people's memory versus individual authorship, and most importantly, German versus French. And so the notion of Bildung was a political weapon, and I want to put that down. No French drama, no Alexandrine verse could be permitted. The revalorization of the German language also led to the establishment, the artificial construction, of a High German or Hochdeutsch, a creation that would stand above local dialects, unify the German tongue in the image of Goethe, and be the result of Bildung now as well. So Bildung is also now a way of making people speak this new language. It may not be accidental that the brothers Grimm became the founders of a new discipline as well, to be pursued as Humboldt's new university, namely Germanistic. The conception of Germans as a nation of poets and thinkers had little in common, therefore, with the institution of a higher learning, quite on the contrary. When Wilhelm Meisters longed for adventure and experience, he set out to travel to study the theater, and he became an artist as a matter of course. He went to Italy and embraced his country's culture. But in this alternative context, Italy was not embraced, but France rejected. Germans were poets and thinkers from the outset already because they were unlike the French. In both cases, that of individual Bildung and that of nationhood had much in common too. Neither the individual nor the nation could proceed without the other. Neither the demand for Bildung nor the birthright of philosophy and poetry were politically neutral. Both, moreover, conceived of a model of progression that looked into the future. Wilhelm Meister and the German nation were to find themselves in some future time. The new German readers had to choose proper reading material, to recognize the literary treasure, to be inspired for the future production of culture and political unity. Perhaps it was Germany's fate to be a nation of poets and thinkers, the representatives of Bildung, But this did not mean that they were supposed to rest on their laurels. Just as an individual formed by Bildung had to go on to produce it, a nation had to continue to philosophize, tell tales, create Bildungsgüter for the next generation. That had to be done without any criticism, I quote. I would like it very much, Herder writes about Shakespeare, for example, that the small circle of men who will read this would not think of criticizing Shakespeare, or lauding him, or excusing him, or banishing him. But they should explain and feel him, Bildung goes to the heart, and make him useful for the task of establishing us as German whenever possible. Criticism is uncalled for, and what the new nation would need is an inner learning and feeling, so that the folk of poets and thinkers would not only learn that it was a nation, but also grow into one. Madame de Staël, that French woman who traveled through Germany at that time and tried to get a sense of the new developments in philosophy and literature, wrote her book on Germany, de l'Allemagne, and she chose not to write about the process of self-definition, however, but simply called Prussia the fatherland of thought and bildung. For Madame de Staël, Germany was already posited correctly, namely outside France. Madame de Staël herself was banned from France by Napoleon, and as she traveled to Germany, she wanted to meet those new leading philosophers. Herder was for her too interested in poetry. Madame de Staël preferred philosophy. She noted down statements and asked for lessons to understand what now was called German idealism. Madame de Staël's research did not only elicit straightforward answers, but also occasional ridicule. Random lectures on the infinite in Johann Gottlieb Fichte's Wissenschaftslehre, for example, of absurd notions. People gave her purposefully wrong and absurd explanations. Goethe lost his patience with her. But still, it was easy to make fun of her, and Wilhelm Schlegel, upright and rather dry at times, decided to act as her bodyguard and accompany her on future travels. But Madame de Staël was eager to present Germany to her French-reading public in a quite different way. For her, Germans were a spiritual elite because they had already encaptured Bildung and were a high measuring stick for all things French. With Madame de Staël's help, Germans were soon perceived as the image of Bildung and as the nation of philosophers. But what was supposed to be natural and innate in Herder became now exotic and foreign for the French. For Madame de Staël, Germans were a nation already with a national character that was a higher spiritual idea. It is, of course, important to note that Madame de Staël completed her research as Napoleon was moving eastwards, rewriting the borders between Germany and France. So where was Germany and France at any time? She had published her book in 1813, at the time of Germany's wars of liberation. Thus, her designation of Germany